It is my great joy and delight to be here with the Reverend Dr. Damayanti Niles and our guest and wonderful Rabbi Scott Slarskey as we talk about our first episode of Sabbath Lab. So, Scott, if you'd like to tell us a little about yourself, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Sure. So, yeah, maybe like kind of a big picture, what the Sabbath Lab is, what the idea is behind it. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about who I am and what my story is. But I think we'll see how this goes. I haven't really done anything quite like this before, but I'm excited to be teaching in this community and with anybody who might be interested in learning together. I was thinking like basically creating like a science class or a social science class around like traditional Jewish notions of Sabbath. And so the idea would be that in this class, we kind of get a feeling for what the Sabbath is, maybe, at least from a couple different perspectives, sort of through text, and I'll tell you a little bit of some of my own personal stories connected with Sabbath. Then next time, what we would do is we would look at kind of like traditionally conceived within the Jewish tradition notions of work and what it means to refrain from doing work on the Sabbath, as well as what kinds of things we do to sort of honor Sabbath and to make it sacred. And we would set goals for ourselves and sort of define hypotheses for practices, right? And so then what we would do between our second and third class is that we would basically carry a lab book. We would commit to a certain kind of a practice. We would develop a hypothesis for what we thought might come about as a result, either spiritually or emotionally or whatever. And then we would record observations and we'd sort of share out on that, and that would sort of be our final class together. So we kind of we get a chance to sort of, in a sense, like study the practice, define and commit to a practice, and then observe what the effects might be and what we might learn from kind of engaging in a practice. It's that kind of a framework is actually it's a very traditional Jewish Musar framework. Musar is a way of doing kind of ethically based work, and this is just kind of turning that onto a ritual practice a little bit. All right, my name is Scott Slarskey. I grew up in a family that was I don't know. It was Jewish in the way that Unitarians are sometimes Christian. I grew up in a family that was proud to be Jewish, but we didn't really do a lot around our Judaism, and Judaism was not an organizing principle in our lives, I would say. It was kind of like something that we felt, but it was kind of amorphous. And when I got to high school in my small town in suburban Massachusetts, where my brother and I were the only Jewish kids in our school, I started to go to youth group, and I started to find that the things that I was doing in youth group, the things that I was learning, and the people I was meeting were just kind of more interesting than what I was doing in high school, and it felt more real to me. And so I would come home on the weekends, and I would argue primarily with my mom. Well, like if we're so Jewish, how come we never light candles on Friday night? If we're so Jewish, how come we only go to synagogue for the high holidays? Right? And my Judaism at its core is really like a Judaism of, I think I've come to understand it as a Judaism of queerness, but at the time it was a Judaism really of rebellion and critique. And I think that as I got to college, and I pursued a philosophy major and a world religions minor, I started to see my Judaism as kind of like a minority discourse, right? It's just kind of like a minority way of being in the world, or a marginalized, I would say now, probably way of being in the world. And so if that's true, then you already have a foot outside the mainstream. And when you have a foot outside the mainstream, and you embrace it, and you kind of express interest in it and own it, then you stand in a relationship of critique to the mainstream, because you're embracing it and opting out of it. And that became a lot what my Judaism really was to me at my core. So I had very little, next to no traditional Jewish learning growing up, but I started in college experimenting with things. I would wear a kippah, or I'd start wear a head covering. It was rarely a yarmulke or a kippah, but it was often a baseball hat or something like that. But that was my way of connecting, which, you know, ritually is effectively the same thing. It just doesn't read the same thing publicly. I stopped doing homework on Saturdays, and I just made like a bright line for that for myself. And the moment where I really had to make a decision, where I had to make sort of a set of decisions around my Jewish observance and committing to it more seriously, was when I was rejected from seminary during my senior year. Because I wasn't expecting to go into the workforce, but then all of a sudden, like, I had to. And so the job that I interviewed for, you know, it's really easy to get a good job as a philosophy major and religion minor. So I applied to a job where all you really need is a pulse. And that job was as a residential caseworker for criminally committed teenagers, which meant that I was sort of it wasn't a prison, but I was sort of like a prison guard, right? I mean, that's kind of what that job was. I was working with 8 boys, or what the job was to work with 8 boys in a facility where kids were committed to the state. In the state of Massachusetts, a lot of those are privately run. This one was privately run. And when I applied, I couldn't wear a baseball cap to the interview. That was not my upbringing. I felt like I needed to dress for an interview. I didn't know at the time that they would basically hire anybody with a pulse, because nobody wants those jobs. They're high turnover, they're high burnout jobs. And so I decided I was going to wear a kippah publicly, and I told them that that I would not work on Saturdays, that I needed to be off from Friday at sunset through Saturday at sunset. And I have to say that at that time in my life, that became probably the most important decision I had ever made in my life. And it saved my life. What I didn't realize when I took the job was that I was committing to a job where I was frequently working 80 to 90 hours a week. I was sleeping over in the program, doing a sleep overnights, and doing like 32 to 48-hour shifts pretty regularly. You know, I was in New England, so sometimes we would get snowed in and nobody could show up, right? Again, it's one of those jobs that maybe some people who are watching this now have a job like this. That, you know, it's kind of not worth risking your health or your life to come into a job like that. So other people have to sort of pick up. But one thing that I was able to maintain was I didn't work for 24 hours. And as crazy as my schedule was and as unpredictable as it was, I knew that I could count on one day, one 24-hour period every week where I wasn't going to work. And the other thing that I took on at that point was that I started going to synagogue regularly. I was the youngest person at Friday night services, probably by about 40 years. And I started going Friday night, and that started to become meaningful for me, and I stopped spending money. The first thing that I really stopped doing after doing homework was I stopped spending money. And having a day where I didn't spend money, and having that day be really the only day I could reliably plan on being off, absolutely transformed the way that I thought about my neighborhood, the businesses in my neighborhood. It transformed the way that I thought about eating. It changed the way that I thought about, it changed to some extent the way that I thought about money as well. And I think that has kind of been a common theme as I've given things up. Part of, for me, what has been extraordinarily powerful about Shabbat is the Hebrew way of saying the Sabbath. Part of what's been powerful for me about Shabbat has been giving up control over things. So giving up control over money, or yeah, giving up sort of perceived control over my cash flow for one day, and giving up, we don't use, we're pretty traditional in the way that we do Shabbat. So we don't use electricity, we don't cook, because we don't start fires, we won't jump in a car and drive anywhere on Shabbat. We generally don't carry things from public areas to private areas or across. There are all these categories that we'll go into, some of which we'll go into next time. But I realize, like turning on the lights at 5:30 before the sun goes down and leaving them on for 24 hours made me crazy because it felt super wasteful. And then it made me conscious of the way that I was using electricity for the rest of the week. And, it's really weird to do Shabbat as an individual, but I didn't know any different. And so that's how I initially developed a sense of meaning around it. But as I got older, particularly once I went to rabbinical school, the communal aspects of it were just like blow away brilliant. People invited, it's like, it's kind of anathema to even think about this right now, but like people just invited themselves into your home and you invited yourself into theirs and you invited your friends and you invited people who weren't your friends. And so it was something that I didn't grow up with because I know that this is a thing that is probably familiar in a lot of ethnic communities, like non-white communities, but in my family growing up, it was not a regular thing to invite neighbors over for a meal or to be in a neighbor's house. And so that was very regular. It was very regular in rabbinical school to have my professors over for meals. That was not weird. That was like, it was almost expected, right? And they would have us over for meals. And we would sing and we would eat. And nobody was cooking because everything had to be prepared ahead of time. And so what happens when you can't make stuff and you can't benefit from other people making stuff is that you have to live in a world which is perfected, right? At some level. Like you have to live with a world that you're not striving or struggling to change. And that's like
a kind of sufficiency.
Yeah. And I think that's how it creates rest, right? And so what becomes really important, right? It creates opportunities for relationship. It creates opportunity for, and for singing, which is kind of like non-physical art. Yeah, so I don't know. I kind of, that was actually like longer than I intended to talk, but that's a little bit like my Shabbat story, I guess. And I guess like where that sort of leads right now is that I'm in a place where we do Shabbat as a family, the three of us. My wife is also a rabbi, and our son, who's a 10th grader in high school. But it's really tough to be in a place where we have consciously built, where community is an important part of our religious practice, and we just don't have it. We can't gather that way right now. But, the other aspects of Shabbat very much, I think, hold us.
That's wonderful. So can we ask a couple questions of you, Scott?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any, Damayanti?
Sure, I do.
Off the top of your head? Or?
Well, the piece of, because as a Christian living in a predominantly Buddhist and Muslim world, Buddhist and Hindu world, the choice, the choice to be Christian is much more. Here, I find it actually disconcerting because everybody and their Aunt Gertrude is culturally Christian, I'm assuming that's what you felt when you were in Jerusalem, is
That
right? You don't have
that was one of my primary crises of meaning when I went to Israel for the first time. Absolutely.
Because you're like, everybody does this. But part of it is because I was raised being deliberately Christian, not in juxtaposition, but there were things that we did, like Sunday morning we couldn't go places because we had church, and that we had these rituals, and the community is what holds it, right? The little Christian community, where 2% of the population, tiny little community, holds it together. And I know what you mean, because now there is no community to hold it together, and that's hard, to figure out how to do that. And so, what does it mean to do meals? You don't prepare, but you're really spending that time with people, right? When you're not preparing the food, and the food is not being prepared for you, what you're doing is really going, we're here just to touch soul to soul. And
yes,
what is the Jewish tradition? What part of your tradition helps you make those connections, right? Because we're trying to be spiritual without the normal templates of our spirituality being afforded to us. So what else in your tradition gives you that energy? So you're like, Shabbat saves me. And I believe you 500%. What is it that, when the obvious things of ritual and community are not there to feed you, what else from the tradition comes to rescue you, if you will?
I love that. That's a great question. So for a lot of Jewish history, the primary mode of worship was not prayer, right? It was text study. So yeah, like that's big. The challenge for me with that is that there is so much infrastructure around Shabbat. There's so much kind of like spiritual infrastructure that holds it, that when that kind of like, whoosh, and particularly the communal part of it sort of like blows away, like it requires building to create a relationship of text study. But yeah, chavruta, like chavruta is the Hebrew word for like for collegial learning, like one-on-one learning. That is, for me, that's like mini Shabbat. It's like you look at a text and you like throw ideas back and forth. And I love the idea of like non-hierarchical text learning, where the text is sort of a foil for helping people to engage with each other, but is a necessary foil because that's kind of what elevates the conversation and focuses it. For me, like that's a thing that holds it. That's a thing that holds like a flavor of the Shabbat and the community.
That makes sense. But yeah, in liberation circles, we call it base community learning, where rather than the priest and telling you what to do, the community comes together around a text. Or Lexco Divina is another place for that. It gives me places to connect. And for people from my part of the world, we not only look at the text in the Christian world, we use Hindu text as a counterpoint. Talk to each other. That makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the affect of it as well is like very nourishing, because really the traditional way of doing it is one-on-one, right? And one of the metaphors that's used is like iron sharpening iron, like minds sharpen minds. And there's an encouragement to disagree with people, not to be like, not to be cruel, but for sure, like even to be heated, and to be passionate. And so I think, that one-to-one relationship, which which requires trust and requires close listening, and engenders curiosity, right? I think curiosity is like super liberatory. I'm less familiar. I've read some Christian liberation theology, but not to the degree that you have or written, I'm sure. And so curiosity, humor, like even kind of irreverence. There's a way in which, like, when you have a text in front of you, the counterpoint to the text in some sense is sometimes the irreverence, which actually can be super liberatory. Like that kind of humor and irreverence, I think, can be super liberatory.
I agree.
Can I follow up with you on something that you said? Oh, here we go. Something that you just said a minute ago about, for those who are joining us, we're continuing our conversation about the Sabbath, and so glad to be here with Rabbi Scott Slarskey. And as you were talking about your kind of evolution into seeing Sabbath as a really central part of your week and of your formation as a human being, one of the things I heard you say was that during Sabbath, there is perfection, that you can't fix anything, you can't do anything, so you have to accept that what is enough. And I wonder if you could just give us how you see that in terms of like God's perspective, because of that, I think of the creation account in Genesis 1, and on the seventh day God rested, and how that informs what you said about that kind of rest.
Yeah, like 100%, right? I mean, that's the original, right? That's the model, right? I mean, the two biblical chunks, right, that I had sort of thought about bringing for tonight are both that. Because I think that what's powerful about that is like there's a doing, there's a doing, there's a doing, there's a doing. That's actually not a good characterization, but there's a doing, a reflection, and an evaluation. There's a doing, there's a reflection, there's an evaluation, right? And it's very structured for Genesis 1 through the beginning of 2. And also, even in the way that the early biblical scholars kind of like chunk the text, like, you have the Sabbath cut out. Like the Sabbath is the beginning of chapter 2, right? You've got 6 days of creation, and then you've got the Sabbath, which is the beginning of chapter 2. And biblically, there's the phrase that's used to describe the Sabbath is that it's like tov me'od. It's like very good. It's the only day that's described as being like very good. Probably what good means is complete, right? At this kind of level of biblical meaning or whatever, this level of language. It's probably like this happened and it was seen as being like sufficient. Like that's like that one's done. Good. Okay, here's the next day. Done. That's done. That's tov, right? And then like there's like a reflection at the end, and there's a sanctification, right? Sort of like an elevating or it's almost like a setting aside of creation for sacred purposes, right? And an evaluation which kind of like elevates it even to a higher level, saying that it's like tov me'od. I don't know that I'm totally answering what you're saying. I think I may have wandered and lost the thought. So bring me back. Tell me where you wanted me to go.
Well, I think this is really helpful to me. It was really, I guess I had thought of Sabbath, like you're saying, it was to say it's perfect, because what I heard you saying is that there was a sense in which on the Sabbath, you stop and you look around and you feel the sufficiency of your life. And I guess I had never really thought about that before.
So think about if you could turn off all of your striving and all of your anxiety, hypothetically, like, wouldn't that be nice? I mean, for like 30 seconds. I'm not saying forever, but like if you could do that, like if you could just like turn the spigot off on that for a little bit, what does that do?
You went back to, you do stuff and it's all good. And then you just be, and that's It's not perfect. It's very good, which is, I think, is better than perfect.
Mm.
It doesn't have that ranking. It's very good. And the word that, unfortunately, I have a father's an Old Testament professor, so I learned all this there too. But the piece that he always says, the language is whole. It's not perfect. It's just whole. You pause and live in the rhythm of in the rhythm of life. And I think that, and you connect this also to Deuteronomy. What is Sabbath but the mercy law?
Yeah.
When everything stops, nothing works. Every living being stops. And it's so Sabbath is not only sufficient, it's merciful.
Yeah.
I think that the marriage of that for me is very powerful. It's a moment of mercy to yourself and every living creature.
Yeah. Yes.
I love that. I just love that.
Yes, and I can't help it. I'll just say this in your community, and it's anti-capitalist.
Amen.
And it's anti-capitalist because if the whole point of capitalism is commodification and manipulation of resources,
yes,
then you just turned all of that off.
Exactly.
There's no acquiring of new things. There's no changing of status of things. Your skill to make things more useful or to make them more valuable is turned off. Your anxiety about acquiring enough is turned off because that's set in place. The other story I was going to bring is the story of manna, right? Because that's where God teaches Shabbat as pedagogy, right? And so there's no more production when Shabbat hits. There's no more food coming in when Shabbat hits. That's the wall, right? So, and this is a little bit aligned with some of the texts that I wanted to bring tonight, which I feel a little bit silly even bringing them. I'll tell you what, I'll put them in the chat because I created a That's the link. And if you want to go to the Google slideshow with the text, we can do that. But the texts that I'm referring to are, that's very much like the anti-capitalism is very much aligned with, it's aligned subtly sort of with what Heschel talks about, who's kind of like the guy in Jewish theology around Shabbat, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel. But it's also very closely aligned with people who aren't afraid to talk about that stuff more explicitly in our day and age, with Michael Fishbane, what he says about Shabbat, and with Brueggemann, what he says about Shabbat. I mean, his work on Shabbat is fantastic, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that it's deeply rooted in traditional sources. I think it really honors Old Testament and rabbinic conceptions of Shabbat. And I think that he brings really useful contemporary insight into the utility of those practices, and the theological significance of those practices. So those were like the three people that I kind of wanted to look at. And there are a few quotes, very brief, that are in that Google slideshow that we could look at.
Scott, I don't know how to do that, but I made you capable of sharing simultaneously if you want to.
Oh,
sorry.
All right.
Hit share screen.
Yeah, I'll share the screen. That's fine. Okay. Do you see that?
Thank you. Uh-huh.
All right. So those two links are to Genesis 2, which, Rebecca, is exactly what you talked about. That's like I do believe that it's often useful if you want to look at a concept to go to the roots, right, and to take a look at the initial description of it. That being said, clearly institutions evolve, and Shabbat, as we practice it, is not like, it would be a little much maybe to say that the Shabbat we practice is like God's Shabbat. I mean, that's a little bit strident, perhaps. But the second one is the manna story, right? Which really is like, I think it's just such a beautiful, brilliant story. which shows these like, these awful, terrible Israelites who are just, God bless them, they're struggling so hard against being slaves, and it's really not easy to not be a slave. And it's worse to be a slave, and it's not easy to learn how to not be a slave when that's all you've been doing for generations. But all they're doing is acquiring, and all they can think about is what the resources are that are available to them to, even when it's like literally falling from the heavens and provided every single day. And the story about people going out and gathering more than they can use, like we would never do that. Go to a supermarket and buy more than we can use, or gather in any way resources more than we can use. But that's what the Israelites did. And it molds and it grows maggots. It's disgusting. It's fantastic. And then lo and behold, on the Sabbath, they go out to gather again, even though they've been told not to. And the counterpoint to the maggots is that there's no bread. But guess what? Like all the manna that they got from the day before just happened to be sufficient. It happened to be enough to sustain everyone. That's what Shabbat can be. That's what the Sabbath can be, I think. Look, I also just want to kind of like sidebar that there's a certain degree of privilege that allows people to take a day off. So I don't believe in advocating for like spiritual liberation that's materially unattainable by people. I don't think that does anybody any service. So I'm not saying that you need to like spend your last dime to celebrate a traditional Shabbat. I'm just saying that like in its ideal conception, for people who are blessed to be able to do that and to bring in other people into that kind of observance and to create that kind of an atmosphere where we can take care of each other. I do believe that we live in a world which would allow us, if we used our resources right, to take care of each other once a week. All right, sorry. That's there's that shtick too.
It's the interesting thing where I come from is the day of rest is different for each community. And what happened at home was the community that was at rest was cared for by the communities that were still working, vice versa. And it became really poignant after the bombings in Sri Lanka at Easter. The Buddhist, if you ever hear that Buddhism is a religion of peace, yeah, whatever. But what happened was when the Muslims went to pray and did their day of holy prayer and rest, the Hindus and the Christians took care of them to make sure they could rest and work and not get harmed.
Yeah.
The very next day, the Christians and the Muslims took care of the Hindus. And then on Sunday, they took care of the Christians. And that was a sacredness, because talk about communities caring for each other. They made it possible for each of those communities to take their rest, because we took care. It was their time of rest, our job to take care of them. And when it's our time of rest, there's sufficient other to care for us. And I think for me, that was a poignant moment, and made the day of rest sufficient at a whole nother level of beauty. And I remember that was part of the whole point of each of us knowing when it was our turn to care for and when it was our turn to rest. Which again throws in the face of capitalism. It's not about what you get; it's about caring. The work is for care, not for getting enough. So
yes.
Maggot-filled crap normally.
I mean, what I also love about that, that also speaks to me, is this sense of pluralism. Diverse expressions of like devotion to God. And one of the things that this is like goes to the core of why I'm really a religious pluralist. I really believe that it's a gift that we're on different sacred calendars. It's a gift that we have different modalities of expression of awe and of curiosity and of delight. You know, like that. I mean, how fantastic is that? You know, like, I think it does allow, I do believe that it's precisely those kinds of differences that allow us to connect in meaningful ways with each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It makes it all possible. And part of why I've come today was to watch another tradition teach me how they do rest, so I understand how to do rest in a more pluralistic way, right? I think that's that makes a difference, so that we know the sufficiency. Because unfortunately, in the U.S., Christianity has become a mode of empire and capitalism, and to strip all that back to our spiritual healing again is so critical. It makes so much difference.
So maybe we'll take a look at one of the texts here. Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe a little bit also in that spirit of sort of stepping outside of dominant culture to kind of like put our toes in the water of a marginalized culture and see what is critiqued, right? Or just to sort of raise an awareness of what could be different, right? I'm seeing Bill's phone, but I'm not sure that, is Bill there on Bill's phone?
Hello, Bill? There he is. There
Oh, all right, cool. Hello.
Yeah, I think we're unmuted now, aren't we?
You are.
Yeah, I'm so sorry we are late.
Oh, you're great. No worries. We got it recorded, so if you're interested in watching whatever you missed, that's totally fine, but I'm glad you're here with us.
Good. Well, thank you. We're glad to be here too.
Yeah.
Would anybody be willing to read out loud that the first text? This all comes from Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was it's interesting. You know, he escaped from the Holocaust, and he came to the United States, and he's an interesting dude. He came from a long line of Hasidic rabbis and ended up teaching in progressive Jewish seminaries, both of which were a terrible fit for him. And both of which he was in both of which he was terribly reviled, both for his mysticism and also for his commitment to social justice. Actually, Jewish community likes to name check him these days, but he was not a popular dude at the time. All that being said, I feel like that's like not the most positive painting of him. He wrote. His prose is like poetry. I mean, his writing is spectacularly gorgeous, and it's difficult to imagine anybody could describe the experience of Sabbath with greater heart than Dr. Heschel did. Would someone be willing to read number one?
I'll
Cool.
read one. Okay.
Nice.
He who wants to enter the holiness of the day must first lay down the profanity of clattering commerce, of being yoked to toil. He must go away from the screech of dissonant days, from the nervousness and fury of acquisitiveness, and the betrayal in embezzling his own life. He must say farewell to manual work and learn to understand that the world has already been created and will survive without the help of man. 6 days a week we wrestle with the world, wringing profit from the earth. On the Sabbath, we especially care for the seed of eternity planted in the soil. Oh, was I muted that whole time?
No, you're good. We heard you.
Okay, I was like, no. Okay.
So yeah, that's how he starts his book. Those are literally the first sentences of his book on the Sabbath. He just jumps right into it.
I see in there, Scott, very much what you were saying about that not the primary component of Sabbath, perhaps, but certainly one part of it is the sense of being unleashed from capitalism, from the systems that of commerce and commodification in there.
Yeah. So like aesthetically, how would you describe his characterization of Sabbath? Like, what do you imagine this feels like? What's the picture that he's trying to paint here?
I feel like a donkey that's been untethered, like a workhorse, whatever creature that is just plodding along. And this is sort of the loosening of all those binds and being set free.
I come up with a different sacred text, and that is, "Be still and know that I am God." That's what this. It's like all of the running, all of it's sort of the gentle but very firm voice of God going, "Be still and know that I am God." There's a release of worry, of even self-value. What you're doing to try and make yourself feel better. You don't have to, just be and be in the presence of the living.
Yeah. Yeah, and so if that's true, who is that threatening to?
All of the A-type personalities in the world.
And
I'm being a little bit facetious, but it is. I'll just be confessional. I spend so much time like, did I get it done? Is it good enough? Have I done my work right? Is the world, is God pleased with me? And there's this sort of like, just stop. Just stop. Let that go. Just be present. And if it's good enough, it's good enough. If it's not, it's still good enough. That sense of release is a powerful thing. And I'm an A-type personality, very confessional. So the spiritual discipline of not allowing that sound to continue in your head is terrifying and releasing all in the same moment.
yeah, like I can't help but wonder what happens when somebody shifts from trying to measure themselves to awe.
Yeah.
Or to gratitude, right? Like if a lot of what's driving our actions, or if even some of what's driving our actions is good enough, am I acquiring the things that I need to acquire, whatever that is, money, status, more congregants, whatever it is, right? And instead, the energy that goes towards that evaluation and retooling, right, that constant like retooling the production line, what if that went to gratitude? Like, how would that change my orientation to the world? How would it shift my relationships with other people? How would it shift how I allocate my time? If gratitude were actually number one, not forever, But what if I took gratitude so seriously? What if I took gratitude, just for one day? What if I took it as seriously as I take achievement? Just for one day. What if I took awe and amazement and wonder? How would that drive my behavior or my attitude if I just allowed myself to take it, as seriously as I take my professional competence, or how good I am as a father, or how good I am as a pastor? What if I just let awe take over? If I could allow that to happen, how could that shift things?
What I hope this isn't an aside. What the text in the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, that really strikes me is those stories that Jesus tells about the king who gives the feast, and everyone is compelled to come in. I mean, people won't accept the invitation, and so all these others, he's just like, bring them in, the poor and the lame and the whatever, bring everybody in, and we're having a feast. And it strikes me, I've never thought about those as a Sabbath text before, but there's a sense in which it's creating a place outside of the usual standards of how we have to be with each other.
Sweet.
And yeah, which it sounds like that's what Sabbath is about. It's saying, I'm not going to relate to you in my label of whatever it is I carry around during the week. I'm going to relate to you human to human with a heart of gratitude for the space that sort of transcends those other moments of my week.
I love the challenge of even just staying in that early statement that you made. Like, what if we could shift the context within which we relate to people? Right? Like, what if the fish could just drain the water in the tank and refill it with seltzer?
Yeah.
Might be fun for a minute. You might not want to live there the whole time, right? but it might be fun for a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Shabbat is pretty powerful spiritual technology for a shifting context. For shifting the context of relationship. I think that's a really nice way of saying it.
It gives me, remember last week, Rebecca, when we went for a walk and we were talking about, and I just said, I am tired of always being Dean Niles, Dr. Niles. Every relationship is about that. I've forgotten who Damayanti is in the process, right? That everybody relates to me as Dean Niles or Dr. Niles, and I don't even remember who I am when I'm not being the dean or the professor. And that was a heartbreaking reality. And the relationship I have with Rebecca has been that gift. Which is why I quickly corrected, yes, I was a professor, but really, she's one of the few people I get to be a human being with, who's not her professor, who's not her dean. She's not looking to me to do those works. We just, and a sacred moment to be able to just be a human being, and not the. And not what we do and the titles that we hold and the jobs that we do. It's exhausting. It's just plain exhausting.
Yes, I think I am going to say that, I think if I want to run a footnote commentary on that, right, to sort of value that and support what you just said, Damayanti, I might say, look, so part of the technology that we use is that one of the categories of kind of prohibited work on Shabbat is hachana, which means preparation. You can't prepare for what you're going to do when Shabbat's over.
Wow.
So, and you're not, and a lot of people, I try to keep this as well, are careful about what they talk about as well, right? So the whole thing is like, it's a lot of intentionality work, right? So if somebody comes up to me and wants to talk about, wants to talk about how their kids are doing at school, or wants to talk about a policy decision at school, I won't talk with them about it on Shabbat. And I'll just say, I'd rather not do that on Shabbat. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. We can set a time and talk. And try to do it in a way that's kind and people don't feel judged, because that's not what I mean by it.